thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome to the latest instalment in our Keeping It Real webinar series. Today, we'll be discussing how to excel at generating longitudinal real-world evidence in rare diseases. I'm Emma Bagshaw. I'm a senior medical writer here at Vitaccess, and I'll be hosting the session. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker. So I'm joined today by Mark Larkin. Mark is the founder and the CEO of Vitaccess. He has over 20 years of experience in HUR and real-world evidence consulting. Mark founded Vitaccess with the aim of harnessing the power of digital technology to better represent patients' voices in drug development and market access. You might have seen that we were also expecting to be joined by Catherine Bottomley, our Chief Scientific Officer and Head of Patient-Centered Research. But unfortunately, Catherine is unwell today and is unable to join. So Mark will be bravely going it alone. So what do we have in store for the next half an hour or so? So I'll begin with a brief introduction to Vitaccess. We'll then have a few quick polling questions just to gauge the level of past experience and knowledge of our audience before I hand over to Mark to begin the main discussion. So Mark will start with making sure that everyone is familiar with what we mean by longitudinal real-world evidence and why it can be of value. He'll then delve into the details, so going into how to generate this type of evidence, both from the perspective of designing a study and then once the study is planned and approved, how to execute that and how to monitor it and keep it on track over the period of the study's duration. Throughout, Mark will be including examples and considerations from rare diseases, and he'll be finishing with a case study from our own experience. At the end of the webinar, we'll have a question and answer session. So please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar. You should see a chat box in the webinar menu panel. So feel free to put your questions in there. We'll try and get through them all, but if we don't get a chance, then we'll follow up to any questions via email where we can. Okay, let's start with a little bit about us. So Vitaccess is a patient-centric research organisation, and we specialise in real-world primary data collection. So we work closely with our clients to design and execute research projects that put patients and their caregivers first. So the kind of things that we might do, it could be a cross-sectional online survey that asks caregivers about their quality of life, or perhaps a long-term app-based study collecting data from patients about their experiences of living with and managing their conditions. We might combine that with clinical data from patients' medical records reported by their doctors so that we can gain a really full picture of a patient's experience and their journey with their treatment and managing their condition. Our key expertise is in these areas that you can see on screen here. So real-world evidence, analytics, HUR and market access, patient-centered outcomes, and localization. And we feel that by bringing all these functions together in-house in one place, we're able to design and run global patient-focused studies that generate reliable, relevant data. So that's about all on us for now. So what we're going to do is have a couple of quick polling questions. You should see those appearing on screen in a minute. Just to gauge an idea of your past experience with longitudinal real-world research. So if you don't mind popping your answers in for those now, and then we'll give you a few minutes to do that and then see the results. So looking at whether you've ever been involved in designing or running this type of research before. Do you currently have any questions, research questions that this type of study you think might be able to answer? And if you have had experience with longitudinal research before, have you ever been dissatisfied with engagement levels? So sort of participants, whether they remain in the study, remain active, submitting surveys, providing data, because we know that that is a key challenge with this type of longitudinal research. So thank you for putting your responses in there. We should be able to bring the results up on screen in a second, and we'll see what everyone has to say. Okay, here we are. I hope everyone can see that. I'll just run through them. So first question, have you ever been involved in designing or running longitudinal real-world research? We've got about 3/4 of people said they have. So that's good to know there's some past experience in the room here. Do you currently have a research question that a longitudinal real-world study might answer? About 50-50 on that one. So I'm curious to know if anyone does have any particular questions. If they're wondering whether this kind of study might be suitable for them, then feel free to get in touch with us. We'll be happy to answer your questions there. And number 3, have you ever been dissatisfied with engagement levels of a longitudinal study? So similarly, though, that's exactly 50-50. That's interesting to know. So hopefully, for those of you who have had troubles with this in the past, we'll be talking a little bit about what you might be able to do to mitigate against that. And if you see any drops in engagement levels, what you might be able to do to address that. So yeah, interesting. Thank you very much for taking part. Okay, right. I think it might be time for me to hand over to Mark to begin our discussion. Okay, Mark, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma. Hi, everyone. So as you saw in the agenda, we're going to quickly give you a primer on what we mean by longitudinal real-world evidence and its value. So if you go to the next one, Emma, then look broadly, I mean, I just really quickly make the distinction between real-world evidence, evidence derived from real-world data, which you see in the second paragraph there. And what does longitudinal mean? You know, research conducted over an extended period of time. So that could, but there's variability in that, can range from quite short, a couple of months, to 5-10 years even. And there's a huge variety of types of data that we can be talking about. So Emma mentioned that the clinical outcomes data, which we can capture from electronic medical records via an ECRF, patient-reported data, caregiver-reported data, and within that, that can be quality of life, that can be treatment satisfaction. So really, a very broad range of data types that we can capture in longitudinal studies. So we go to the next slide. What is the value of this? So, you know, and think about this also through the lens of rare disease research, where often the understanding of the disease can be relatively poor. So we have the opportunity of creating a broad data set over time. So the ability to answer a range of research questions, although there are some practical implications of that not being too ambitious and overburdening patients. We can look at changes over time, of course. So not only for things like obvious candidates such as neurodegenerative conditions, but many other conditions where changes and patterns are of interest over time. And then changing and understanding impact of disease and treatment in clinical practice, and how changes occur. And then, of course, this type of research complementary to randomized controlled trials, different objectives. And so, you know, obviously in randomized controlled trials, typically narrower, more selected, homogeneous patient populations versus real-world research has the opportunity of having broader patient populations and therefore answering different questions. So value in a range of areas then, if you want to move on, Emma. So how to excel? We haven't, this webinar is relatively short, and so these pragmatic suggestions we're going to make are introductions, really. So we appreciate that we can't go into depth on a lot of this, but on a lot of these. But what we thought would be a good way of structuring this session is initially thinking about drivers and recommendations that we could make in the design of studies, and then afterwards I'll talk comparably about recommendations in the execution of studies. So initially starting with design on the next one then, Emma. So four areas for your consideration that you see there: planning data usage, stakeholder collaboration, piloting, and really trying to maximize the value of technology. So I'll talk about each of those in turn. Next one, please. So planning of data use. Now, this may seem obvious, but actually when designing studies, it can be tempting to have very broad research, multiple research questions, try and generate lots of data and lose sight of the primary objectives for a study. So It's really, really important to think about where you're trying to get to and work back from that in terms of the planned data use. So first box, you see the planning of what's the purpose of the study? You know, do you have a problem? If you're going to generate data and there are no other types of data that exist already that you could use. So you generate some data, who's it going to be used for? How might they critique the data as well? How will they use it in decision making? So thinking about that as carefully as possible from the beginning is really important. So this thinking will help you focus the data set. You may have a range of outcomes that you're looking for. It might help you to prioritize those. Remember, if you're doing a digital study, there can be the opportunity of adding stuff more easily than perhaps if you were doing a traditional paper-based study. And this will avoid you excessive data collection. So, you know, fishing trips, as we've said here in the slide, which can be catastrophic. And if you overburden, particularly patients, you may get no engagement and have no data. Secondly, sharing the results. So we'll talk about that more in execution of that when the study is executed. But here at the planning stage, thinking proactively about how you're going to share the results is really important. Developing a publication plan. Rich opportunities for publication exist in longitudinal studies in general. So publication plans are really valuable means of engaging with co-authors. Can be, you know, not just clinicians, but potentially patients, patient advocates, if you've been involving them in your study design. And actually the act of thinking about publications and the conferences, the journals you're going to target is actually quite a useful exercise in terms of prioritization of your data capture. And then think also about sharing the results on an ongoing basis. If you've got a very long-term study, people have engaged in that, given their time, etc. So not providing feedback as you go along risks losing some of those important stakeholders and misses out on an opportunity to engage with them early, particularly if you're using digital tools. So if you are going to share results, who are you doing it with? Are you going to share them with patients themselves, steering committee, sites themselves? You know, again, we'll talk about that when we come to the execution. And finally, yeah, sharing results with participants is a key factor. In all the studies that we do, particularly in rare diseases, people aren't doing it for the time, you know, for the money or anything else. They're really doing it to advance research. So sharing results with them, showing how that their input has been valuable from a scientific perspective is really, really valuable. Next, talk about linking the data with other data sets. So if you are generating data, it's only one type of data. There may be other data sets that are available. You know, national data sets exist in many countries. So thinking about that, the design stage is really important. If you don't, you risk not being able to do it, either because the data set does not permit the type of linkage you might hope to do, or you may not have got informed consent from for that linkage from your participants. And then will you use the data in future research? So again, for that specific case, important to get informed consent if you're going to from your participants if you're going to do that. Okay, going on to the next one. So that's planning in advance, stakeholder collaboration. So particularly in rare diseases, it's a wonderful opportunity to collaborate with a broad range of stakeholders. So you'll be familiar with the collaboration with the patients, clinical sites, for instance, and then engaging with, ideally, with decision makers as well. But in our experience in rare diseases, patient advocates and the patients and caregivers themselves are usually very willing collaborators for longitudinal studies, if they're done in the right way. So we highlight at the bottom of the slide a few sort of pointers for you in terms of how that can be useful in the study design and the protocol that you can read through yourselves. But you know, what we found, I suppose, as a summary, is when we have done that engagement with those broad range of stakeholders, we do better research, quite simply. It does take time, but we would argue that not doing that is seriously a risk for the quality of your research. So we would really strongly advise that. In terms of the materials on the right, again, these people have perspectives that can provide input on materials. So that from a recruitment perspective, informing of patients, in informed consent. And again, on the flip side, if you haven't engaged with those stakeholders, there's a risk that your informed consent's too difficult, your information briefing sheets don't make as much sense as they could, etc. So these are potentially quite key issues or risks that you run if you don't collaborate with that range of stakeholders. Carrying on then. Include a pilot and testing phase. So often in our discussions with sponsors for longitudinal studies, particularly in rare diseases, people have global launches, as we understand. So the potential of doing studies across lots and lots of different countries and with potentially quite long follow-up periods is quite significant. You know, we've worked in a couple of neurodegenerative conditions, for instance, where having quite long multi-year data capture is attractive. However, even if those are your long-term plans, the value of piloting and testing is significant. So if you're designing a study and you haven't thought of what the pilot should be, then I would actually say you haven't thought about it carefully enough. So we found that when we do that, invariably there are benefits and learnings that come from that. So it's a big risk not to do that. It does have implications, of course, in terms of the overall timeline. But again, if you're in it for the long haul and you're doing a long-term study, better to test in a pilot phase than not to test at all. And in the box, you'll see a couple of examples that of pilot phase testing. And actually, one other thing to add as you read through those is we've still found that when we're using digital tools, that's still relatively new. So asking people to test digital tools, look through screenshots, look through demo versions, that's still relatively novel. So people tend to be quite open to that and give very good feedback. Moving on. So nice segue then, maximizing the value of technology. So there's a few things that we've found which a digital approach to these longitudinal studies offers that we've listed here. So one is for rare disease studies, if you are doing remote recruitment, and that's one design question, that can boost numbers, which can, of course, when you're working rare, ultra rare conditions, casting one's net as widely as possible is very beneficial. Patient convenience. So if it's done right, and as we previously talked about, needs to be tested very carefully. So assuming you have a very nice user patient experience, the convenience for data capture can be a real plus. So enabling patients to provide data on any time, any place, within their daily lives, with the caveat that one shouldn't overburden them, of course, can give you more frequent data than you would otherwise have with non-digital tools. Of course, accessibility norms, and those norms exist for that you can look up sort of for this type of interface, are important, and that's key to make sure you're giving people who can, depending on the condition, also have some difficulties, could be with vision, for instance. So really important to use accessibility norms. And we found using digital tools can really drive engagement, which we'll talk more about in a minute when it comes to the execution. So, for instance, giving notifications to people and them being able to decide what type of notifications they have. Is it push notifications in an app? Is it email? Is it SMS, which works really, really well? And then again, this is to set up what we'll talk about in the execution part in a second. But use of rewards. Rewards always work, in our experience, as a really important driver of engagement. So, doing those using digital means is far more customizable, if you like, to the patient experience than perhaps historically. So rapid data transfer, a really big one. We've been able to have posters from studies that just weeks after launch, for instance, which is from a commercial perspective can be a significant advantage for sponsors, and the fact that all data are digital, that's a key driver of that. And again, linkage to data from different sources is relatively obvious. And then one of the things that we'll talk about in the execution phase is the different aspects of giving feedback, which digital tools lend themselves pretty well to. So infographics, dashboards, which you'll see examples. So considerations for success, tailoring. So that's important. Linking to testing and piloting. Don't assume the cookie cutter approach, even if you have had success in a particular indication with a particular design or type of feedback or reward program. It's important to test the different cohort that you're now working with to make sure there's no differences in that. So don't be tempted to just you use the same approach that you've used in another indication. And then we've talked about, just to move on relatively quickly, we talked about testing already, and we don't have to go into this time to go into this today, but security, data protection, anonymity, really important. In onboarding stakeholders, they will ask about those things, so make sure you have you're using a system that's beyond reproach in terms of security and data protection. So moving on, so that was a bit of a whirlwind tour of design aspects. I'm going to move on to execution then. So if we go to the next slide then, here are some pointers to successful execution of longitudinal studies. So monitoring, adapt, you can read them yourselves, rewarding, etc. So I'm going to talk about each of those in sequence, starting with monitoring, please. So here's monitoring, you'll all be familiar with, important for longitudinal studies in general. That's not new. I suppose what we found in the digital studies that we specialize in is that we can do rapid monitoring. So that, when to monitor, we would say start monitoring pretty quickly, soon after launch. On the right of this slide, you see a series of recruitment curves from a study we did, and each of the curves represent patient numbers over time in each of the countries we launched in. You might not be able to see, it's quite small, but we've got a couple of hundred patients in a couple of those countries, and looking at those recruitment curves right pretty much from the get-go in each of the countries is a really good opportunity to, if things are slow, make changes. And if you can do these things really quickly, why wouldn't you? Okay. Also, that type of monitoring is a really nice tool to use to drive enthusiasm and engagement of your stakeholders. So in that study particularly, some of those countries have really brilliant recruitment, very fast recruitment. For this is a rare disease, by the way, as well. And the ability for them to see that themselves really motivated them. It was really, enthusiastic. We know that designing and then implementing these studies can take a bit of time, but this is the sort of recompense for some of those stakeholders when they see these recruitment curves as the beginning of the monitoring. And of course, if any of those curves are slow, we can work with the different stakeholders and try and work out why we're getting slower recruitment, and if there's anything that we can do to remedy that. So talked about dashboardings there, and additionally we've got more formal analyses. So typically we would have a statistical analysis plan that's developed in the pre-launch phase of a longitudinal study, and then with a series of interim analyses that are formal interim analyses that are conducted, say every 6 months, maybe every 12 months. And those are another good example of monitoring where we could look at the study variables. Are they answering the going towards answering the research questions that we have, as well as perhaps study KPIs that could include engagement, which I'll talk about in a minute. So, and what to monitor, that's as I've mentioned there. Just a quick word also about site monitoring. So we've talked about giving feedback to patients, to perhaps steering committees with dashboards, etc. For site recruited studies, sites are a really important sort of stakeholder group as well that shouldn't be neglected. So what would we be looking at in terms of monitoring for sites? Well, are they adhering to the protocol that's specified for the study? And then there's also source data verification. So is there correspondence between the ECRF and the underlying electronic medical records for each of the participants? So monitoring, important, do it early, and think about the appropriate monitoring for the range of different stakeholders you have. I'm going to talk about a little bit more about engagement, but if you want to, I've got a couple of resources there for you to a bit of further reading. One is on the measuring engagements. We had another Keeping It Real webinar on that. And we had an ISPOR poster actually late last year on some of the challenges in presenting engagement statistics, which we've thought quite a lot about over the last few years, particularly for these longitudinal rare disease studies. Just go to the next one, Emma. Just, really quickly about measuring engagement. So study design dependent, slightly different for cross-sectional studies versus longitudinal studies that I'll come on to talk about a little bit more in the next slide. And just really quickly, so cross-sectional studies are really straightforward. Percentage of participants completing each or all of the surveys, let's say a web-based study, versus a little bit more complexity when it comes to longitudinal studies, depending on the type of data you might be capturing. So the metrics that you're interested could be could be the percentage of completed PROs at each survey completion window. It could be the checking or the updating of, if you're asking people to provide background information pretty much when they like, or it could be the percentage of your patients using a symptom tracker. So those are different because first one's PRO instruments, there are a certain number of administrations to which people can respond, and the other ones, the patients themselves could be free to use those and complete as much as they like. So that will have a consequence in the calculation, the engagement metrics in these longitudinal studies. So next slide, please, Matt. So adapt, okay, a really interesting one. So we've spoken with sponsors, clients who've done studies where actually there's been problems. Problems happen, right? That's normal. But I think certainly for digital studies, there's an opportunity of changing things perhaps more easily than traditional types of studies. So what would you adapt? You'd adapt if there are problems, back to monitoring, see some problems, make some changes, recruitment or perhaps for engagement. But maybe also if there's new information, you look at that, there's an interim analysis, just something happening that you weren't aware of, maybe that opens up a new research question, for instance. So again, adapting a study, particularly a long-term one, is a really important opportunity. We, again, refer you to a separate webinar we've done around ethical interactions with ethical boards. But if you are making changes, major adaptations will need IRB or ethics committee approvals, and that could mean changes to study procedure or changes to eligibility criteria, for instance. So again, we haven't got time to go into that in a lot more detail, but main piece of advice is those bodies are, in our experience at least, very happy to receive questions about whether they believe that certain changes require ethical amendments or not. So if in doubt, do talk to them. So next one, please, Emma. Rewards. So we mentioned that in the design phase. We thought this was worthy of its own little section, if you like. And there might be, Emma, if you press the button again. Oh, look, there's a nice little screenshot from one of our studies. So, the screenshot shows the sort of thank you, one of the screens related to the rewards programs that we implemented. Here you see participants accrue stars when they do the actions that we would like them to do, that could include, for instance, completion of PRO instruments. They get some stars. At a certain point, they can redeem those to get Amazon vouchers. So that's the general framework. But do bear in mind that there are different. What we're talking about here, really, in sort of psychological terms, is positive reinforcement. So we're giving rewards to increase the probability of people doing certain actions that we would like them to do, and that could be by the use of some sort of financial reward, for instance. That could be a gift card for them personally, or it could be charitable donations. In our experience, both work very well. But do not neglect simply the act of saying thank you is, positive feedback, positive reinforcement. So think about the range of different ways that you can use rewards as positive reinforcement. Relatedly, tailoring the programs is really important. So, if you can, give choice. We not just in healthcare research, but we as consumers, it's recognized the importance of choice. So, as one example, if you can offer people a choice between charitable donations and receiving gift cards, that's good. And then more broadly, tailoring your program, the program that you might have for a young cohort or might be very different from the program that would be chosen or that you would apply to a more elderly patient cohort, for instance. And then finally, just a quick word on return on investment. In our experience, maybe the return on investment for a reward program in a longitudinal study is maybe the best part of the program that you will spend. If you think about the total of the amount that will be dispersed in terms of rewards, if you were using those rewards versus the overall investment for the program, it is pretty small, and yet that can be a significant driver of turning average engagement into very good engagement, or very good engagement into exceptional engagement. So if you haven't got a reward program, again, I think carefully about it, and I think you're missing a trick. Next one, please, Emma. Feedback. So we set this up in the design section, different types of feedback. So think about this very broadly. It could be publications, it could be infographics about the progress that's being made of the study, with the caveat that you don't want to give people, if you're sharing those with participants, patients, information that may bias their ongoing results. There's dashboards. Dashboards can be very powerful. Dashboards can be, as we'll talk about in a second, tailored to different audiences, different stakeholders. Things like study newsletters can be very valuable means of giving updates on the study. Some people still do like reading things like study newsletters. Now, we typically don't print them out, they're PDFs, but nonetheless, they're certain types of patients are very happy to receive those newsletters. So feedback, as I've alluded to, tailoring it to different stakeholders is very important. So, patients themselves, with the caveat about bias, sites, but also if there's a steering committee, if what information are you giving them about the study, and of course sponsors. So dashboards are a really great tool to provide feedback, and to tailor that feedback to different audiences. And that's one of the reasons why we've included the dashboarding technology within our platform. So useful to give feedback and tailoring the information. So talked about steering committee and patient advocacy group already, so I think we can move on. So look, some colourful screenshots from some of the studies that we've done to really illustrate the range of types of feedback that can be thought about. So on the bottom left, you see a dashboard with aggregated, anonymized data, close to real time. You can see some infographics there, top left, that could be used both directly with patients or to raise awareness of the study, for instance. Newsletters, self-explanatory, and then publications. As I said, we have found that these longitudinal studies offer significant opportunities for publications that could be posters, could be peer-reviewed journal manuscripts, and using those that have been developed at significant resources around those, but sharing those with the various different study stakeholders is certainly well-received feedback. Carrying on. Publishing. So, I guess in some ways a type of feedback. So what are we going to do? We're going to execute. Fingers crossed, as we said at the design phase, we will have thought carefully about a publication plan. So we're going to be executing the publication plan. First thing to do, again, to generalize, start with the protocol. That's one of the first publications one can do. It shows intent and is a nice opportunity to begin working with the co-authors who've contributed to the design the design of the study. So co-authors, you may be familiar with, of course, cooperating with clinicians as well. In our experience as well, patient advocacy groups can also be very valuable stakeholders. We found a good approach with them, bearing in mind they're not, they don't have the medical experience of clinicians as you'd expect, but actually asking them if they want to contribute as co-authors, and then they self-select. So those people, some of them have quantitative, more quantitative appropriate backgrounds, and they would like to get involved in the co-authorship, the development of publications as co-authors, and that follows nice guidelines for this sort of thing. Relatedly, if you've set up a steering committee for your study, think about having a publications working sort of subgroup of that. Again, people self-select for that will enable you to publish promptly and have a broad selection of co-authors on those publications. A word for plain language summaries as well, that many of you will be familiar with. Just a link there to a nice guide that came out about how to develop plain language summaries. But if you're going to have this collaborative approach, that's sort of a nice corollary of the collaborative approach, these plain language summaries. So those are the 5 tips for excelling at longitudinal studies. And finally, just we've got some data to show you from some of the studies that we've carried out of what that can look like. So essentially, as we've been talking about this, I suppose what we've been providing is some recommendations for how to design and then to execute a longitudinal study to excel. What does excel mean? It means one of the things it means is getting useful data. And what does that mean? It's probably going to mean for a longitudinal study, getting strong engagement with your patients over time. So if you look at the next slide, here's some table showing some engagement rates from 3 different studies that we've run, where and how we presented this is looking at those different studies, all of them longitudinal but different in their design. We summarized what we thought were the key drivers of that successful engagement of those studies. I'll let you read through those yourselves. And then we've put engagement rates, and you'll notice that some of those engagement rates are different. So when we talked about that, we said that it's not always exactly the same engagement rate, engagement metric that might be important for your studies. So you'll see that in these 3 studies that we've mentioned. But what you also see is actually pretty nice, numbers that we're very proud of actually for those engagement rates across those different studies. So, mid-80s to high 90s PRO instrument completion rates in the first one, very long engagement with the study, median follow-up days in the second one, and extremely high rates of general surveys completed by participants in the first one. So I suppose the summary is, while we doing the things that we've suggested doesn't guarantee really strong engagement rates, in our experience at least, they all do drive better engagement rates. And if you don't do them, I mean, I think you run risk of spending a lot of money on doing a longitudinal study and not getting great data. Okay, so I think that might be it, Emma.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. Right, it's time for the question and answer section of the webinar now. So if you do have any questions for us, please submit them now in the Q&A box you should see in the menu panel for the webinar there. Right, Mark, I'll put the question to you. I'll try and go easy on you, seeing as it's just you there. I'll chime in if you need me to as well. Feel free to direct them back at me. Okay, so we've focused a little bit on rare diseases here. Are there any things that you could think of that are like key considerations for doing longitudinal research in rare diseases specifically, as opposed to more common diseases? Are there particular things you should be thinking about when you're doing the planning?
I mean, I suppose I'm going to end up give a general response, which might appear to be a slight fudge. It sort of depends on the indication you're looking at. So, as an example, if you're talking about a neurodegenerative condition where you might think that the engagement period or the period of follow-up for patients needs to be quite long-term to capture changes in whatever the key metrics that you're interested in might be, then that's going to impact the frequency with which that you're going to hope patients give you data. So what that might mean is, look, if you're, and that reflects how quickly the disease course changes. So if you're looking for a change over that may be only apparent over 5 years, then it's probably not going to be worth trying to engage with patients on, every month, really frequently, because you may, even if you do all the good stuff we've talked about, you might get some dropout. So that's going to be balanced by the hope that the data capture you're doing becomes a nice habit for people, right? So it's not burdensome, they're motivated to do it, and they do whatever you're asking them to pretty regularly, and it sort of becomes ingrained in their habits. So that's for long-term neurodegenerative conditions. I suppose the other thing is about to think about, particularly for rare diseases, about representativeness, number of patients, and how you're going to recruit them. So there's if you're doing a site-based study and you're hoping to get a particular number of patients, then the number of sites you have is going to be quite an important factor, both in terms of the ability to get to your minimum N number, but also representativeness of the wider population. So if you only have, if you're only recruiting from a leading teaching hospital in France, is that necessarily going to be representative of the broader cohort of that disease in France? Now, those sorts of considerations are not unique to rare diseases, right? But I would say for small patient numbers, they're probably more important than non-rare diseases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think one thing we found with rare diseases in particular is often the patients there are really engaged with like patient communities, forums, patient groups. I think partly because they're sort of geographically dispersed, they might not know any other patients with that condition. So they found these communities online to be able to connect with other patients, and therefore they're a really engaged group who we found like we had good success reaching out to them, speaking to patient advocacy groups in rare diseases. There's lots of people there who are willing to work with us to provide input early on. So definitely find those groups where these patients congregate, speak to those people, and then tailor your study according to what they tell you. We've also found, I think, because of that, like digital studies have worked really well in rare diseases because people are used to interacting remotely, and it's obviously taking a digital approach is a really good means of reaching patients who might be geographically dispersed. So doing a remotely recruited digital study is a great way to sort of find and get that representative pool of patients in rare diseases.
Yeah, and just to add to that, as the things we've talked about today should be win-win actually in many ways, because we talked about them broadly from the perspective of a sponsor thinking about conducting a longitudinal study and what excelling that means. But actually, when you're engaging with, as I hope you will, a range of different stakeholder design phase, when you talk with them about these different things that I hope you will do, those will be strong levers for them to get involved with you. So they will like those as well. So it's, although we've been talking more from the sponsor perspective, the patient advocacy, the patient perspective, the clinician perspective is not completely different from that in terms of these different levers for success, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Okay, so another question here. How have we managed patient exhaustion after some time? So a bit more context to that. Patients with rare diseases tend to go through ups and downs, presumably in their energy levels, and this is reflected in their engagement over time. So I assume the question is sort of asking, have we dealt with situations where, well, a patient can't complete their survey because they don't have the energy levels to do so, so they're going to miss that survey window? Do they not get their reward? What happens there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So one level, this is back to how one measures engagement. In certain types of study design, you can't be sure that someone who hasn't been engaged for, let's say, 3 months, whether that's because they're simply disengaged from the study and they will never come back, or actually there's particular reasons why they couldn't do what we were asking them to do for the period that we've noticed is missing. So you can't really disambiguate that, apart from I guess, you know, engaging with people afterwards and asking them why they haven't done stuff, which is very sort of time consuming. So in general terms, there's not really much we can do about that other than note that it's there, and note that there are some exceptions, though, that we found in certain conditions where, for instance, when people are having some sort of attack or flare up or crisis, actually we've assumed that within those time windows will get very, no engagement, because funnily enough they've got other things on their mind. But actually we found that although this is very indication dependent, when the flare or the crisis is happening, nothing's happened, but depending on the treatment, if they are, for instance, hospitalized for a couple of days, that is a time when actually we've heard people saying to us, well, during that period I was very happy to engage in the study, because I didn't have anything else to do. I was still in hospital. I hadn't got my family visiting, etc. So there are exceptions, but yeah, in general it's very difficult to disambiguate the reasons for which we might see it's essentially missing data. But we do have to be cognizant of it, and then we also have to be cognizant not of the situations where not people having crisis and flare-ups, but they've got medical conditions. So not being over ambitious in terms of what we're asking from people is also really important. Again, back to what we've talking about in the design and the testing phase. If in doubt, do ask less of people. You can always add more, but if you overburden them and you lose them, it's very difficult to re-engage with them.
Mm-hmm. Something I'm not sure if you mentioned, Mark, that we do always, where possible, try and give people windows in which to complete data entry. So they might have a full week to do a survey, and during that period of time, if it gets towards the end of that week, we might send them a reminder, just a friendly reminder, because life gets in the way, as well as medical conditions. People sometimes just need a bit of help there. And like another thing that we can do is SMS reminders and SMS notifications, where you could send them a notification saying, we've noticed you haven't completed this month's survey. Is it because you're having a flare up? And all they have to do is reply, why? Yes. And then we know that that's why. And it's very minimal effort on their part. And so you've just sort of got that data to understand what's going on there without them having to put more time and effort in.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, our colleagues in our analytics team, we have nice discussions with them about how why data and completion windows tend to be slightly more complicated to analyze. They would prefer it if we had very clean, let's say 3 monthly completions where everyone does it on the dot of 3 months. Say that, as Emma said, that rarely happens, but think about those windows we found pretty useful. So the question becomes how broad those windows should be, etc. And there are analytical considerations from that, as well as testing and input at the design phase.
Thanks. Right, let's see if we've got time for one more question, I think. Okay, this is an interesting one. Can you tell us about any mistakes you've made and you've learned from, or particular challenges that we've come across in the past and we've had to overcome when conducting longitudinal real-world studies?
Yeah, I can give you a couple, actually. No names.
No, we're not pointing the finger, but because we've been doing this for a little while, you obviously learn every time you do.
Yeah, exactly.
So you get to the point where you're like, this is always going to be a stumbling block. Is this something you don't know how to deal with it the first time round, and then now we know this is something you've got to consider?
I would say that the biggest one is around patient burden. And we've been doing this type of study probably now for about 6 years, so I think we've got pretty good experience of it. when we started out, we would have discussions about patient burden with sponsors, which were quite tough. And sponsors say, well, you know, I'd like to do this, this, this. And we overburden patients. Well, you know, sometimes we had the opportunity to do workshops with patients and patient advocacy, etc. We don't always have those opportunities because they're, you know, in the sponsor's gift, really, they cost, you know, time and money. But I think that's the most the biggest mistake we've made is overburdening in the past. Now, not saying it's perfect, but you know, when we have those inevitable discussions with sponsors about, you know, the breadth of the research questions, if you like, I think we're a lot stronger at doing that because we can point to more case studies. Like, you know, actually, we'd really strongly advise you to not do that because, you know, in these, look at these data when you do that. So I think that's the most important one that we've got. You know, you can. It's a lot easier to add than take away, I suppose, is one way of thinking.
Yeah, it's definitely very tempting to try and collect as much data as possible in these real world studies. But it goes back to what you were saying earlier about, like, think about how you're going to use the data. What question you're actually trying to answer here? Who are you trying to demonstrate your arguments to? Like, what are you actually trying to find out? And like really keep that in mind so that you sort of narrow things down and only collect what you need to. Perfect.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think we'll wrap it up there. One thing to say before we go is that if you enjoyed today's webinar, we'd love to see you at our next one, which is entitled "What is the point of real-world evidence?" So staying on this theme here, we'll be joined by guest speaker and real-world evidence expert Jeff Trotter to discuss what is the unique value of real-world evidence and why consider using it, when is it appropriate to use real-world evidence, and we'll be illustrating this with some use cases for real-world evidence across the product life cycle, looking at some case studies from our own experience. So if you're interested in that, look out for our comms material. You'll be able to sign up on our website as well. So that's Friday the 15th of September at 3 o'clock. If you'd like to catch up on any of our previous webinars, including this one, they'll all be available on our website too, and we'll be sharing this one with all the attendees afterwards. So I know we've got some links in the webinar, so you should be able to click on those once we've shared the recording with you. I think that's about everything from me. If you've got any further questions for us that we didn't get to manage, that you didn't get a chance to ask or we didn't get a chance to answer, our contact details are on the final slide, so feel free to get in touch with us there. And any questions that have already been answered, we'll try and reply to those via email. So I think that is all I've got to say now. So thank you very much, Mark. Thank you everyone for attending. So I'll wish you all goodbye and have a nice afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.